Okay. I think we can get started in the interest of time, as I think that there's going to be a lot for us to discuss today. Welcome, everyone. I am Daniella Mastracci. I am a product manager at Powered by People, but 2+I, co-founder of 2+I, so very, very close to my heart. And yeah, welcome to what we promised to be a really engaging and insightful discussion around navigating certification and verification in the handmade sector. Just a couple of pieces of housekeeping. We are going to have some time for Q&A at the end. So please feel free to pop your questions into the Q&A. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little icon for question and answer. Please pop your questions in there. I probably won't be answering them as we're in the panel, but we will get to them towards the end. We'll save about 10-15 minutes for that. So just to frame a little bit before I hand it over to our panelists to introduce themselves, just to frame a little bit about what it is that we're going to talk about today. In our evolving landscape in the handmade sector, where consumers are more and more conscious of the ethical and environmental footprint that the products that they purchase make, and not to mention the nearing legislation around ESG standards, the need for ethical verification, certification, audits, and assessments has never been more pressing. So the question that I often am faced with is, what actually does drive this demand? And how can we make sense of, the terminology that is used? What is the difference between a verification and a certification? And ultimately, how do we as consumers and makers and businesses in the handmade space make actual sense of what is available to us and determine the validity of what it is that we actually see in the market? So I'm really excited to bring together our panel of experts to shed some light on this, and I'll let the panel introduce themselves. Let's start with alphabetical. So, Auret, I'd love for you to introduce yourself. Define, the work that you're doing, yourself, your organization, and the work that you're doing in ethical compliance.
Okay, hi everybody, and thanks for the invitation, Daniella. My name is Auret van Heerden. I have been working on human rights and labor rights issues in global value chains for the last 40 years. And it's a moving target. Let me just say that achieving sustainability, social and environmental sustainability in global value chains is really, really hard. And we've tried various methods over the years. But I think if you look around at the state of human rights and environmental sustainability, you can see that we've got a lot of work that we still need to do, and we need to get a whole lot better at it really fast. Right now, I'm looking at how to scale this kind of work, because up until now, it's been mostly very manual, labor intensive, sending auditors and inspectors to workplaces or to sites to try and assess the compliance in those workplaces. Now we've got to find ways of scaling, partly because the reporting obligations that are coming in through these new due diligence laws, the reporting obligations require much, much more data collection than ever before, but also because we've really got to get more makers, artisans, producers, growers, and so on involved, and we need tech to do that. So that's what I'm focused on right now.
Awesome. Thanks, Auret. Very important work. Sara, let's pop over to you next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sara. I'm the Chief Handcraft Compliance and Research Officer at Nest. We are a not-for-profit organization based in the US, but working with artisanal and handcraft businesses globally. So we have one arm that has a free membership where we supply a lot of free resources through philanthropic donations. But another big arm of that through what we call our guild is our ethical handcrafts program, which is a standard and an entire training, remediation and assessment program that we've developed over the past 10 years. So we created it really out of the need from brands that were approaching us, looking for a way to have due diligence within those supply chains outside of traditional facilities or factories. So really what we call the informal sector of handcraft, home workers, small workshop workers. So we built that up over the years. And I would say the assessment is one part of it, but really it's around the approach and the model to that, understanding that this is really quite new, even still now after 10 years of doing it, quite new for the artisanal sector. So we continue to evolve and develop that. And I appreciate Auret's comment about it's not an easy thing to do, but we're all trying to move towards that mission together. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Sara. Francesca, let's go over to you next.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Francesca. I am a compliance officer of the World Free Trade Organization. I've been working there since 2020. And WFTO is a community of many different kind of organizations. We have producer organizations, but also brands and non-trading organizations that all put people and the planet above anything else, so before profit. And they also commit to the 10 principles of fair trade that have been elaborated by the WFTO membership throughout the years, and which, for instance, include commitment to creating opportunities for economically marginalized workers and commitment to paying fair wages and fair prices and so on. And at WFTO, we ensure that our members do align with these principles and prioritize social and environmental goals through our guarantee system, which is a verification mechanism that uses both documentary reviews and on-site monitoring audits to really verify our members' business model. So it's not a commodity certification system. We don't certify as fair trade products or ingredients or supply chain, but we verify the entirety of a business to ensure that they really have fair trade or social and or environmental mission at their core of their activity.
Okay, awesome. So we have 3 very different points of view in this, so I'm hoping that we'll have some good dialogue going. So to start, let's talk a little bit about, what are the origins and the drivers of the demand for ethical verification, certification, audits, labels, and the like. In your opinion, I'd love to hear where you feel the demand is coming from. And Francesca, let's start with you. Let's go around.
Yeah, so I think it comes from different sides. So I would say, first of all, from end consumers for sure. I think all of us consumers are more and more concerned and aware of the impact that we can have, good or bad, when we make our everyday choices. So we sort of feel like we have a responsibility to be conscious about the things that we are buying. I think it's also coming from brands and buyers. So I would say that brands feel the necessity to know what's happening along their supply chains. And I would say that in many cases, they don't have the means, or they're not willing for whatever reason to monitor their suppliers and producers of products personally. So they need to rely on certification and verification schemes so that they can also justify their practices with their own end consumers. So we go back to end consumers again. And I think also it comes from legislation, which is more and more concerned with due diligence and social responsibility for businesses. So I think at least the 3 different forces are pushing companies being more concerned with ethical and sustainable practices.
Awesome. And Sara, what about you? So I mean, with Nest, you're more, correct me if I'm wrong, but it is more of a business-to-business verification that Nest has been working on primarily versus more consumer-facing. So where would you say the driver is coming from?
Yeah, we have been working with brands, though we do have, in conjunction with our certification, a consumer seal. So we've always been, focused on bringing it, into those 3 parts: the brand, the supplier, the vendor, and then ultimately the consumer. So I definitely overlap with what Francesca just said. Certainly policy, consumers, the brands. I would add to that list that investors are really looking at this. ESG is a huge topic right now, and there's an ever-changing landscape in terms of what is required and expected. And so we see that a lot, either coming from brands or coming from just the general population. And then another one that we've also seen kind of shifting and changing is either employees at brands that are working there are kind of driving how they want their businesses that they work at to look like and what they want those businesses to hold as values. And in addition to that, I would also say some of the vendors, the suppliers, are starting now to come to us independently, whereas in the beginning it was really driven by brands, but now the suppliers, they have built these businesses around, these social values, around what Francesca was talking about. Now they want to look at the social compliance, down into the deeper levels of their supply chain as well. So So lots of demand from all different places for sure.
From all angles. And Auret, and I know when we were chatting about, getting started, you and I were chatting a little bit about the history of this and how it has kind of evolved over time. So in your opinion, where would you say that the demand is coming from at this point?
So I guess if you look at the history of work, we've always had situations where the nature of work evolves faster than regulations around it, right? So we've had periods where child labor was rampant in, the middle of London, right? And health and safety, people couldn't breathe the air. So there's always been this challenge, I guess, to find workable regulations to make work decent, to make it meaningful, to make it purposeful, right? And to create supply chains or enterprises which were sustainable. That got a lot more complicated when production chains got spread out and spread over multiple jurisdictions, multiple countries. Global value chains emerged. Raw materials from one place, transformation somewhere else, sale, retail, and use somewhere else again, and recycling in it, somewhere else again. So it's really hard to create a chain, a production chain, that has the same standards all the way along it, common standards that are respected, and which allows us to regard that as an ethical product, right? No consumer wants to wear a product or use a product that's got human rights or environmental abuses embedded in it, right? So that's been a challenge. And because most of our government and enforcement institutions are national, they lose the plot as soon as a production chain is transnational. Okay. So by the time it reaches the consumer, whose law, whose standards applied, who checked, who ensures that I'm buying an ethical product and that I can feel good about that, right? It's a really, really difficult regulatory challenge. So what we need in the 1990s, there were a lot of exposés about the governance gaps, right, around the world. And major brands got caught out with that. So companies turned to the governments and they realized they couldn't rely on them to ensure those standards. So they came up with private means of doing it, corporate codes of conduct, social audits, certifications. And civil society rallied around that as well and said, we'll fill this governance gap with private actors. So we have this crazy situation where private actors are delivering the public goods of social and environmental standards. That's really, really controversial because we're not mandated to do that. There's no law which says you should do this, and we're not accountable in this way that an enforcement agency would be accountable for its work. So we've got voluntary standards, all kinds of diversity in the way that we pursue those voluntary standards, all sorts of labels to attest to our work, but it's not an ideal situation. And we thought it would be a stopgap measure, okay, in the 90s and the noughts. But here, 30 years later, it's looking like it's here to stay. Governments are not making they're not making a comeback, right? So we've got to come up with a way of regulating our work. We need a forum. We need a convener. For a while, it looked like John Ruggie, when he was the UN Special Representative for Business and Human Rights, it looked like he could convene, right? And he developed the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, but that hasn't become the convening forum. And so I've made this appeal repeatedly for the last 25 years. We need a place where all of us, the regulators, the voluntary standards practitioners, the brands, the suppliers, artisans, makers, can come together and actually say, how are we going to do this? Who sets the standards? Who sets the accountability mechanisms? How does that work? Because not only does the consumer want an ethical product, but right now we're not sustainable,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I love exactly what you're saying, and I think I'd love to wrap up a lot with what you're saying as well in terms of this round table, this convening that we need to have in order to kind of really make advances in this space. But just to touch on what you had, one of the things that you said, there are so many certifications, so many labels, so many organizations that are working towards ethical compliance, and then so we have the market is flooded with all of these claims, and then not to mention there's a risk of greenwashing and false claims because there is so much on the market, and the consumer, how do makers and consumers actually navigate how complex this has become, because there is such a passion and a drive to become more ethical in the businesses that we conduct. Do you feel as though the market is flooded with labels? And how could we, or yourselves as in your organizations, help consumers buy with confidence? What kind of efforts are being made in order to build awareness at a consumer level? Because ultimately it is the consumer that drives this demand, because the consumers want to see the ethical products. They want to purchase products that they know where they've come from. And they're putting pressure on governments in order to actually put regulation in place. So the drive comes from the end user. So how can they make sense of it all? And what are you doing in order to help them achieve that? And Sara, let's start with you on that.
Sure. Well, I think it's not just an issue in the apparel and like home goods sector. I think there's just a lot of label confusion everywhere. And it's just, I can, as a consumer myself, like understand it's just hard to distinguish between all of those as you're going to kind of buy a product. But, when we set out to create the standard that we have, we kind of created this initial model first that's really rigorous, and it includes third-party verification and on-site, going on site and really looking at everything up close. And so we connected that to our certification, and then we hold that really as the gold standard. However, we are working with, so many artisan businesses in a lot of different ways. And so we know that journey to get to what we call, a certified business, it takes time, it takes, investment, it takes a lot of energy from these businesses. And so over the years, we've created, pathways to get there. So how does someone kind of come into it, start learning and educating themselves, putting practices into place? But then we realize we have to be very careful about that too, because we don't want to even greenwash ourselves. If the certification is the gold standard, we should uphold that, knowing that people will be taking time to go through that process. And that's also amazing. And we can figure out other ways to communicate that, but it's not a label, or it's not a seal on a product, because that should really represent and hold something. But what we do at Nest, there's a few things. I think a lot of it really centers around education, but we do, validate the marketing around products, especially with the, the use of our seal that does go on products or on websites. We are also trying to provide as much public information regarding what our standards are, the methodology, brands that are using that, so that consumers can make sure that they're getting something that is accurate or is really holding what we say that certificate holds. And that goes the same for the consumer, and making sure that when they're purchasing that product, there's ways for them to, kind of get into the storytelling of it, because we really want them to see who's making that product, where it's being made. And so I think that public awareness is really important to our mission. And then one other thing that we've been doing, kind of standing, a little bit outside of just the certification and seal process, is we also have a research arm within Nest. So we've been publishing a report called The State of the Handworker Economy for the past few years. And that is really, taking kind of Nest out of the equation, just looking at the industry as a whole and being able to communicate to consumers and to the public about, why is this important? Why are these, workers who've not had visibility for so many years important to be considered just as any other worker within the supply chain? So I think those are the ways that we're trying to kind of address that and make sure that everyone is really clear on what we mean when we say certification or other terms around the standards.
Awesome. All right. I know when we were chatting yesterday, and Sara, something that you had mentioned there as well around kind of the storytelling. Do you feel as though storytelling can sometimes be more powerful than a certification or a label? you know, is it more powerful? Can it mean more to the consumer? If they can actually see and visualize the process, the people, the hands that actually make the product versus a label. And a little bit of a controversial question, but you know, is that more valuable than actually getting certified? I'd love to hear. Yeah, right. I'd love to hear your point of view there.
So they could go together, right? The label, if you like, could be a QR code that the consumer can scan and actually see back to the producer, right? With the tech we have available now, we should be able to make transparency real and I would say total. You know, I've had a difficulty, I must say, with most certifications, lack of transparency. I really think it's something of an elephant in the room. We have to talk about transparency, but meaningful transparency, you know. And now that you could have streaming video and, you know, people could exchange a lot of information even on 2G phones, you know, there's really no excuse for creating radical transparency to coin the term. The important part of that is to, as I say, is to make it meaningful, because we tried publishing our audit reports. At Fair Labor Association, they still do publish their audit reports. Public can't interpret that. It's too technical. They don't have the time. So that's why they need, you know, a simple logo, right? But then somehow, if they want to, they've got to be able to see what's behind that logo. So for me, that's the challenge now. Use the logo, attract their attention, give them a sense of confidence, but give them the opportunity to drill down if they want to.
Love that. Francesca, I'd love to hear your point of view on there and on chime in on all of this.
Yeah, I think that also storytelling and labels should go hand in hand. I mean, storytelling without labels risk to end up in being easily fair washing or greenwashing, even without, you know, the intention to do so. But it's difficult then to sustain some claims. And the labels themselves can not be enough, or in a way, they can also be misleading, because the label is just something on the product that cannot tell you the entire process that's behind that. So it's also maybe not enough for the consumers to understand, okay, but what does it mean? So I think that both are very important. And I think what we should do as both verification, certification systems is try to be as clear as possible with our communication and really make it clear what we stand for, what our label means, use the correct terminology, as was already said. Like WFTO, we really tried to stress the importance for us and for our members to use the term verification instead of certification, because we really wanted to clarify there is a difference between these two. And then when it comes to issues of, again, greenwashing and fair washing, I think there are different things that we can do. First of all, like we can really take responsibility for our own networks. Like we do all have systems that need to be solid in order to avoid that our own certified companies or members just like behave in like not in a responsible way when it comes to communication. So that's why we also have audits that check that communication is done in an ethical way. And at WFTO, we also have a Fair Trade Accountability Watch, which is a platform, so a page on our website where anybody could potentially file a complaint against a WFTO member in case they don't align with our principles. So it's an additional way to ensure that there is a monitoring and there is responsibility, even in these cases, even if communication is not done properly.
Yeah. And, you know, I completely agree. And I think having these kind of whistleblower, these mechanisms in place in order for channels for consumers or you know, to go to if they see or know or hear something that's off. You know, I think, and I don't think that we'll find an answer to this, but, you know, I think one of the questions that I have about this and in terms of the labels is, or that I ask myself is, you know, sometimes brands, you know, will they create their own label? Like a self-claim that I am, you know, I practice fair trade practices. I am a fair trade company, but not with a label or certification or verification process. And I feel like that sometimes is where the challenge might be with a consumer, where it's, you know, it puts the onus on the consumer to do that research as to whether or not this is an ethical business, look into them, rather than, I mean, I love the idea, you know, matching the storytelling with the label is really what's essential, is so that you make sure that you have that transparency connected with an entity, and that mark that's actually on the tag that's on the product can really help to drive that home for the consumer, so they don't have to go away, do the research, and then come back and make purchase. So making it as easy as possible for the consumer. I'm going to switch gears with my next question a little bit, because this is something that's definitely, I mean, Sarah, I'm going to start with you on this because of the nature of Nest's home worker compliance process. So when actually looking at the process of you know, certification with home workers, or just ethical compliance in general, a lot of the responsibility lies with the maker or the producing organization. And in order to verify processes, more often than not, there's required feedback from the actual producers and employees themselves. How do you know that the responses that you're receiving from these producers, these employees, are actually factual and verifiable, rather than them feeling like they need to say what they're supposed to say? Do you feel as though there's enough measures in place, you know, in assessments and certifications, verification systems, in order to ensure that makers and artisans are actually feeling safe disclosing information?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. I mean, I don't want to speak for anyone else's systems. I can really only speak for Nest and what we do, but you know, a lot of our work is in very rural areas, remote areas. You know, we don't work in factories where workers, you know, are face to face, you know, in the same building. There is an HR department. You know, these are individuals who often don't even really realize what their role is within the supply chain. And so an important part of the work we do does center around those worker interviews, because if you, I mean, take the certification and the labels out of it, the work that we're really doing is trying to kind of build visibility and these systems that can improve worker well-being at this level of the supply chain where it really has never been done before. And so a lot of our program, I mentioned before, it starts with training. So we come on site, work with the businesses, and the goal there is really to be establishing compliance practices and systems within the organization themselves, and not through Nest, but like with Nest support. And so the businesses generally take 12 to 18 months, even just putting those systems in place and kind of getting into the field where their workers are, because often they don't even know maybe who they are or where they are or who all of them are. And so there's a lot of community-based work that's happening and happening at kind of the central business level, and then all the layers in down through the supply chain. And so as part of our assessment process, we go into the homes of those workers. The workers are selected randomly, and they're selected at the time of the assessment. So even though the assessments are announced, those workers, you know, it would be impossible to kind of coach all of them before a visit. And so we do choose randomly. We go into their homes. We want to make that interview, you know, as comfortable as possible in the location that they're used to being in. We work with translators, local translators, if we need that. And so that also helps to kind of create a relationship with them. Before any interview, we have consent that is given to them, it's read to them. We are really emphasizing the fact that this is, you know, it's confidential, it's voluntary, they can skip questions that they don't want to answer. And so during the course of our assessment, we also interview a number of workers so that we can also see if there are kind of trends, everyone giving the same answer, you know, kind of just, you know, answering in very simplistic ways. But, you know, we have encountered coaching. It's our auditors or assessors are trained in identifying those answers from workers. And I think also with the relationship of just building trust and working hand in hand with those suppliers before they go to the assessment, it kind of lowers the guard that like, oh my God, I need to kind of make this to be able to be certified. It's that like we're giving them all of those resources and support and consultation so that they're ready for those assessments. And not to say everyone is certified in the first time around for sure, but I think that nature of the program versus just kind of an audit that they've had to prepare themselves really changes the relationship and that kind of the need to feel like they need to coach, rather than being able to identify if there's still ongoing areas of, worker education or things like that too.
Yeah, I think it's very valid. I think that it's really important, especially I liked what you said about kind of training in order to identify coaching before it actually happens. And just a question, and Francesca, I'm going to direct this to you because I know how WFTO's, the guarantee system works, and with the audits, how you use local or regional auditors. And do you think that it has a difference whether an auditor is from within the community, within the country, is that the assessment is being done in versus a third party traveling in from overseas, coming in with a translator? Like, do you think that has a different is received differently from producers when doing interviews with artisans?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's better that the auditor is as local as possible, also because then it's really attuned to the local context and to the culture and to the language, because yes, one thing is also having a translator. One thing is really knowing the specific dialect and the shapes of in the language. So I think, and also they might be more aware of issues that are peculiar to that specific maybe community or local reality. So they would know better what kind of questions it's important to ask, because of course there are things that need to be checked in every country for every business. But then if you know that there's a particular issue going on, maybe you know that you will need to dig a little bit deeper into that. And I think they are also perceived better in the sense of more familiar. And not someone, because sometimes auditor, especially when we use the term auditor, sometimes we feel like producers not always like the idea of being inspected in a way. So our audits are not inspections of producers if they are not members. They are actually just visits to understand the relationship that they have with our member. So it's not really like an exam that they have to pass, but still it's perceived as such. And I think that when someone that's from their local area is there, it's way better. It's like it doesn't seem like something is coming from top down, but it's more like a bottom-up approach.
Yeah, and I think, I like what you said, is they look at it as an exam, and I think that, I know, Auret, you and I were chatting as well about, I think more often than not, a lot of producing organizations, makers may see ethical compliance as a pass or a fail. What kind of language should we be using, or what kind of systems could help in order to make sure that that's so there isn't that pressure, so you don't feel like you're about to go into a test, but rather you're there to collaborate and share and have this, I know with WFTO it's this continuous improvement. So what kind of measures do you think that could be used in this space in order to encourage that?
Right. I really appreciated what Sara was saying earlier about the need to build capacity at the producer level 100%. Or the maker level before we assess them, right? What so often happens with audits is that it's like giving a student their final exam on day 2, right? We haven't actually prepared them to meet those expectations or those standards, right? So we've got to start off with a needs assessment. So in our system now, we do what we call a readiness assessment first. We identify the gaps and the shortcomings, accompany them to fill those, and we only take a baseline after that, okay? And this is a second innovation we've introduced. Too many systems fail to get a baseline, so they can't actually measure progress. So we try and capture that baseline, precise performance level, and then monitor progress over time. And then we can assess outcomes and ultimately impacts, right? So for us, it's a process. It's not an event. A lot of audits are just a point-in-time event. We're trying to capture the whole process and really over 2 years minimum, tell the story of how that maker or how that producer has developed their systems and their performance levels over time. And have we reached a point now where we can get consistent results, where a buyer would know that, yes, that maker has systems in place which will give me consistent compliance.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, definitely. And completely echoing what you're saying about, Nest with that training, that level of involvement before even any certification, because it cannot be done overnight. It's not, you can't just walk in and achieve this kind of certification.
Right. And sorry,
on
just
that, yeah.
with PBP, we're using the same term, verified, that you just mentioned, Francesca. So, I think verified is a safer term, shall we say, than certified. Certified, especially when you're certifying the future, is a high risk, as I'm sure you know, Sarah. So it's a tough one.
Yeah. And building that trust is so important, right? And I think that you only get that trust with time. The trust doesn't happen immediately. Trust comes from being involved and understanding the business that you're working with. So that being said, I'm just last question, just for us to have a little bit of dialogue around, as we're talking, all right, you're saying 2 years, Sarah, you mentioned 12 to 18 months for the certification process. For a lot of makers in the space, the path to certification or the path to verification to ethical compliance can be really daunting. Like knowing that you have to go, it's a long-term commitment, and often it can be costly as well. There's human resources, there's financial resources that need to go into it. Not to say that the benefit isn't there, but it is. It's a big mountain to achieve or to climb. So how do you think, or how could a maker, how should a maker decide on whether certification or verification works for them and which one works for them? And do you feel that for us as a sector, is there an opportunity for us to create kind of a baseline? Or this is going back to what you had mentioned earlier, is, where's this body that comes and creates these kind of standards as a baseline, which can be a stepping stone to certifications, to verification, but for makers that maybe aren't quite at that level yet, or aren't prepared for that level of investment, whether it's time or resources. Francesca, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think that having baseline requirements for everybody would be very valuable. And I'm thinking especially for those organizations that for different reasons do not want to or are not ready to be verified or be certified, but still want to develop their business according to certain ethical and sustainable standards. So definitely, I think that what we can do in the meantime, until we have that, is like trying to make some of our tools and like learning materials available for those that are not certified, but our system or not members of our associations, so that they can still benefit from them and then maybe get certified or verified when they are ready. And yeah, and also you asked like when it's difficult to choose like what kind of verification or certification, indeed. And I think it's a very personal choice, and a business would have to consider many different things. It's a matter of cost. It's a matter of what do you actually want to certify. I mean, it's your business. Like, do you have an alternative business model that you want to be verified, that is set up on certain principles, or do you want to just certify one of your products or one of your supply chains? So there's also something we need to consider. And I think also what your buyers want, because many brands or buyers are really clear in what they want to sell. So they probably want you to be certified according to a certain scheme. And in that case, I think that the choice is probably what you're going to choose in the end. And also, if you are directly selling to end consumers, also maybe which label is most known in the countries you are selling, in the markets you are selling, because then it's also something that you need to consider. So yes, I think ultimately it's a very personal choice, and what we can do is really, again, try to be as clear as possible with explaining who we are and what we do, so that a business can really make a conscious choice when they decide what to apply for.
Definitely. Yeah, I think that's extremely important. I think that it always does come down to what is the right fit for you, but it's understanding where that lies. Sarah, I know that yesterday or the other day when we were talking about how can we as a sector work together on this baseline, you were talking about working, like the partnership and working with WFTO and trying to kind of collaborate or find alignment in the two certifications. Could you talk a little bit more to what you guys are doing in that space?
Yeah, well, we've been talking only at this point, but
Mhm.
the kind of impetus of that was that a lot of the members of what we call our guild and the WFTO membership are overlapping. And so actually, I think the demand came out from the suppliers themselves, like, hey, we're in both, programs doing all of these great things. How can we kind of align that? And what WFTO does and Nest does are both amazing, but also very parallel. So we're doing things at different levels. And if you talk about verifications at different levels for different types of things. So I think there's a lot of room for collaboration because it's not really competition at that point, and it's more just like building that community, especially around, we work with the artisan sector, so around that artisan sector to make sure that they understand, like, what is the difference between these two? What is the process we're going through? Is there any overlap if I'm doing one and then I want to do the other? And I think, of course, all coming back to the bottom line too, if there is, the guarantee or the certification, how could I then leverage that even more by having both? And so our discussions so far have been around, kind of just looking at the community and being able to educate on both sides about what we're doing and how those members can get involved. And then ideally down the road, looking for ways to kind of have more alignment. And that's something, we've been looking at beyond WFTO even, but, we work in supply chains that are often connected to factories. So there's, audits going on at the factory level. When, homeworking is identified, it's like, okay, now we're bringing in Nest, it's a separate thing, but how can we then be more aligned with those auditing, bodies that are looking at it? I think, Auret, you brought this up earlier. It's like the supply chain is now very huge, and it's across, different cultures and geographies and even production sites. So it's like, how can we create something that just looks at like that entire process, even though we specialize in the homeworking section and others are specialized looking at factories. So I think that's just, when we created the standard, we were hoping it to be like a singular standard for the homeworking, because we included a lot of industry input from brands, from the suppliers, from industry partners, hoping that we didn't have to have audit fatigue and we could kind of create that as a baseline. And then that standard is open. Vendors can use that however they want, even without Nest. But to the question you asked earlier, like, we're looking at ways to bring the training of that program and learning the expectations online, because I think another aspect that is missing here when you do things like self-evaluation or self-assessment, kind of without that more rigorous verification process, is that some of the businesses, because this is so new, they don't actually really know, like, am I meeting compliance? Like, I would say I am, so I'll say yes on this form, but in reality, to the level that the industry is looking at across the entire supply chain, it may not be. So there's a lot of education that has to go into understanding, what is really the requirement, and are you meeting that, or, are there just some improvements that you need to be making as well?
Definitely. I love that last piece that you said, because it's, understanding the depth of compliance is like, you don't know. We just don't know, and across the board, it could be different. It could be interpreted different at different levels. And it's so, again, it's so complex. And
we tried that route. It was difficult because everyone's speaking different languages.
It's hard. And when Auret and I were chatting, I think I loved your analogy to, there's no air traffic controller. So, Auret, I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about, how complex the systems have gotten now, because I love the way that you articulated it, where, there's no air traffic controller that's kind of pointing us where to go, and how can we come together and, again, define what these baselines are. Again, define these baselines that are open to everyone, where it's like, this is your starting point. This is how you know if you're on track or not. But it does take having, we need to have everyone come together. If we don't have that, then where are we? Yeah.
Right. So, I was saying earlier that we're moving from an era of voluntary standards to mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. And there are a raft of new EU laws which all have this due diligence component in it. And so the EU is aware that hundreds of thousands of enterprises around the world are now going to have to start collecting data on the material risks which they face, or the material risks which they represent to society and the environment. And that's creating, even for large companies, that's creating a massive scramble for data now. So that's cascading down the value chain, right? And it will get down to the smallholder, literally the single producer or the smallholder farmer will have to be able to provide answers if they want to stay in that value chain. So the EU is looking now at some ways in which it could leverage multi-stakeholder initiatives, industry associations, and so on, to try and do some of the common work that could help those smaller, those SMEs and sole proprietors and so on. So they're asking, what's the equivalence of these different systems? A fair trade verification or a Rainforest Alliance certification or a Nest certification, how do these align? And do they, if we put them side by side, does it cover 30%, 50%, 90% in common or not? And so they actually want to come up there. I think they're going to issue an RFP for some agency to do an equivalency evaluation and rate all of the existing systems of monitoring and auditing and certification and so on, so that they could say, a buyer could say, you've already got that and you've got that, so I know the only gap remaining is this, let's try and fill that gap. So we could target the auditing and verification and certification resources much more specifically and reduce the burden of duplicate auditing on the rest of the value chain actors. So that's one thing which is going to happen. It will take some years. I think the OECD is going to be involved in that process as well, but it will start to bring some coherence to the system. Okay, we'll at least know who's involved and what they do and more or less how they compare. Okay.
Yeah.
But the backside of that, I don't want to take too much time, is I'd say to producers, take the initiative, just get good at this stuff. You're going to be bombarded with requests for information. And so just start to put in place the capacity to track your energy usage, your water usage, your emissions, your waste, know all of your suppliers, know where you get all of your stuff. Just start to collect information and so that you have it when you need to provide it. And we can all help. We should put our forces together to really create templates and spreadsheets and just simple apps, whatever it might take for producers to be able to do that.
Definitely, and I think that I think this aligns very much with the working groups that we're doing in terms of these best practices in developing kind of standards that can be shared and open source for the sector. And Nest and WFTO have been involved in Handmade Futures initiative for the past over a year, and Auret, you're welcome to join as well in order to continue to work through establishing this baseline. And I think that just kind of closing up the panel, then we'll go into a couple of questions. So if you have questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A. I think I love what you said about just get good at documenting, at collecting the information, be prepared, because it is going to become more and more required at a legislative level. So by starting to get prepared, get your file, make sure your documentation is in place, making sure that you actually know how to answer questions that may come, I think is going to be a really good starting point in order to be prepared for what's to come in the future and the direction that the handmade sector is moving. So thank you guys so much. This was a fantastic conversation. Let's see if there are a couple of questions. I got one question from Jenny. Hi, Jenny. So what are the most frequent reasons why a maker wouldn't be certified or verified? And are there repetitive reasons? So we can kind of just go through a little bit of a round table there. Francesca, if you want to start with that.
Yes, so but just to make sure that I understand correctly, it's like a reason why maybe they tried to get verified, but they don't manage to overcome the process. Okay, I think that actually it does not happen very often with WFTO, because if you do not meet the entry requirements, we are going to already inform that business during the application phase. So during the application phase, we really check that there is a mission that is connected to fair trade, that there are some provisions regarding the reinvestment of profits. So really some pillars that are really fundamental to become at least a candidate within WFTO. So when that phase is done, and when you are within the community, then we see like all the procedure very much as a work in progress. So as we also mentioned before, it's really it's difficult that a member gets terminated because it doesn't meet monitoring requirements. Of course, there are some requirements that need to be met at a certain point and within a certain time frame, but we understand that all of our members really live very different situations, so they might need different time frames, or they might implement certain requirements in different ways. So we are sort of always open to find a way around that and try to keep them within our community. So, but if I should say something that maybe might be a problem for some organizations when it comes to meet the requirements, is that many are not, especially new organizations, are not really they do not really formalize some of their procedures. So let's say that in practice, yes, they do, which is pretty much what Auret was saying, like maybe they are implementing ethical and sustainable practices on the ground, but this is not formalized. This is not written anywhere. This is not in legal documents. This is not in reports. So it might be a problem to verify that, because you cannot just believe a statement that is done. You just need some proof. But it's also something that I think it's possible to work on that. No, it's just a matter of put everything that you are already doing on paper.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Yeah, no, I like that answer. Sara, what about on your side with Nest?
Yeah, I think, Daniella, you said it earlier about the language of like pass or fail, and we've also been really like intentional not to use that word. And I even, the assessment is a really necessary like milestone in the process to check on progress. But sometimes I hate the certification being tied to it, because sometimes it's like certification or not. And then I have like failed and I've not gotten anything. And yet we have businesses who have worked so hard and put so many systems in place, but then they get to their first assessment, they might not be certified. Mainly, I would say that the top reasons are meeting minimum wage requirements. We work in a sector that is primarily paid on piece rate. So when we come into a supply chain, I would say 95% of the time or more, those businesses are just going by an industry rate. They don't actually have a way to calculate a wage for piece rate work against the minimum wage in their local area. So there's an enormous amount of work that has to be done helping them to even kind of set up that system within their supply chain, and then actually do the work of identifying what those minimum wages are. So that's a difficult one. But I would say, kind of in line with what Francesca said, is just sometimes the supply chain is also very large, and so they're on their way, they're making progress, but when we come into a particular business to work on this program, sometimes what they're lacking is actually staffing to actually sustain a social compliance program, which we're hoping to help them, set up and grow over time, so that even if Nest is not there, they are able to sustain that internally. But I think the other part then is we also have a scaled scoring system that just looks at improvement over time. So to get certified the first time is a lower bar, and then it continues to increase over time. So we set that up as a way to kind of encourage people that, they can get to a certain point, but we still want to encourage them to continue making improvements, but over a longer period of time.
Okay. Cool. All right, what about on your side?
Yeah, similarly, we explained in our assessment, we explained that there's no pass fail, no correct answer. It's a needs assessment. It's tell us what you're doing, how you're doing it, and then we'll figure out how to strengthen that. And we rank the responses on a maturity scale, not on a pass fail scale. Okay, so they might start off with informal, we note that, then we help them to formalize. And I have, with Powered by People, we developed a system of accelerators. So we take groups of makers who've got a particular shortcoming or a gap, we put them in an accelerator, and I have two incredible colleagues who then work with them week by week with specific templates and say, okay, we're going to teach you, help you to do this, right? And they work through it intensively, review it after a week, go take it to the next level. And every one of those, the incentive is that it's also going to make you a more efficient business. Okay, so yes, this is something you need to get good at in order to answer the kinds of due diligence questions that you'll face in future. But in addition, it's going to make you a more efficient business. You'll save money, or you'll be more productive. You'll have higher quality. You'll have a better quality of work. So there's there's a double incentive to doing it, and it's working really well. So we accompany makers to achieve that level that they need to achieve.
Awesome. Yeah. So you go along with them, and kind of this is a Adam, I'm going to get to your question, just alluding to Cindy's question where she's saying it just is really hard as a small business when you have a headcount of 4 people in total to allocate the time that's required for audits and certifications. It's very tough when you're wearing all the hats and the costs, and it is. And I think that, I think what's important to note, and just going along with what you're saying, is that it's going to become more and more important. So just getting started is the most important thing at this point. And you can take your time, but just actually starting making that start in that documentation, collecting the documents and everything as you move forward. And we've got 3 minutes left before we need to end, but there's one question specifically for you, Sara, from Adam. Can you talk more about the scope of your global site visits? Because it seems like a massive and daunting undertaking.
Yes, I bet it does. Yes, we do work globally. We're not working in all countries at the very moment. I think we've been working in about 30, a little bit over 30 so far. But we have scaled the program up over the last 10 years since we started. We have an internal team that does some of that, but we are working in partnership with local, you can say auditors, assessors, whatever you want to call them, but that have been fully trained on the program. So in key geographies, we are able to lean on them as a growth in terms of our assessment. So Nest retains the training since that's very core to our mission as an organization, and that like remediation support to the businesses, and then assessments. We have a larger team to implement those. And of course, if there's maybe political turmoil, or I don't know, like an earthquake, we probably wouldn't go somewhere at that particular time, but when possible to travel, we can work globally too.
It's awesome. On that note, thank you guys so much for joining us on this session. I hope everyone who's been listening in has enjoyed it as well. This will be available. It will be recorded. It'll be available in the lobby after the event has ended if you wanted to rewatch it. And we'll be sharing the content on PBP and TeepleSci sites as well after the event. Thank you guys so much, and enjoy the rest of the session.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Enjoy.
Francesca.
Bye.
Thanks. Cheers.
Bye.
Bye-bye.